Welcome back to the DRM News Podcast. Today we're going to be looking at Chrystia Freeland's pledge to dismantle a division within the CRA
Oh, wow.
if she becomes prime minister. It's the Research and Analysis Division, and this is a move that's creating a lot of discussion, especially among Canada's Muslim communities.
Right.
It's not just a run-of-the-mill political promise either. This story really dives into allegations of systemic bias within the CRA and questions about
Yeah,
the relationship between the government and religious groups and
absolutely.
the whole idea of oversight
Right.
and fairness within institutions. So we're going to take a deep dive on this one.
What I find so fascinating here is the timing of Freeland's pledge. It comes right in the middle of a liberal leadership race where she's trying to become the next prime minister.
Right.
And it really suggests that this is a calculated attempt to address concerns within a key demographic, Canadian Muslim.
Okay, so let's break down exactly what she's promising here.
Sure. So she's made a two-part pledge.
Okay.
The first part is that she's vowing to completely dismantle the Research and Analysis Division, that's also known as RAD,
Okay.
within the CRA. Now, this division has been under fire for years because of accusations of discriminatory auditing practices that single out Muslim charities.
Okay, so that's part one. What about the second part of the pledge?
The second part is all about setting up an independent body
Right.
that will oversee the CRA.
Okay.
This is a big deal because it directly responds to these concerns about a lack of accountability and transparency within the agency.
Right.
So it's all about making sure that audits and compliance processes are conducted fairly and without bias, especially when it comes to religious groups.
So essentially, she's promising to dismantle this controversial division and then create more oversight.
Right.
Why now? Why is she making these promises at this particular time? We know that the relationship between the Liberal Party and Muslim communities has been strained,
Yes.
especially because of the party's stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict.
You're absolutely right. And we've seen Muslim liberals pulling their financial support from the party.
Wow.
We've seen staffers refusing to work on campaigns.
Right.
And we've even seen protests interrupting Freeland's own campaign launch speech.
Yeah.
So her pledge is a direct attempt to mend this broken relationship. She's signaling to Muslim voters, I hear you, I'm taking your concerns seriously.
And to make it even more impactful, she's committed to implementing these changes before the next federal election.
Absolutely.
This isn't just some vague promise for the future. It's a concrete campaign pledge.
It adds a layer of urgency
Right.
and accountability. It forces her to take action if she wins.
Okay, so let's move on to the RAD.
Okay.
What exactly was this division's role within the CRA?
Well, the RAD had a pretty crucial role. They were tasked with investigating potential sources of terrorism financing within Canada.
I see.
And it was created after 9/11 when the global landscape changed so dramatically.
Yeah,
And there was just this heightened sense of urgency around national security.
that makes sense given the climate at the time, but
Right.
if its purpose was so crucial, why all the controversy?
Well, the controversy comes from how that mandate was actually carried out.
I see.
Muslim charities and civil liberties groups have been warning about the RAD's methods for years. They're claiming that auditing practices were discriminatory.
Right.
Basically, they're saying that Muslim organizations were being unfairly targeted simply because of their religious affiliation rather than because of any real evidence of wrongdoing.
So it's not so much about the RAD itself, but more about how it was implemented.
That's exactly it. That's the core of the issue. Critics say that the RAD just didn't have proper oversight and that they relied on biased assumptions and stereotypes.
Yeah.
This led to excessive scrutiny and hardship for so many Muslim charities, even when there was no evidence of any illegal activity.
So these are serious accusations. Is there any evidence to back them up?
Well, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that supports these concerns. For example, a 2021 report by the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group,
Right.
that's a well-respected watchdog organization,
Yeah.
found that the RAD conducted audits with very little accountability or independent review.
Right.
And they found a startling statistic.
Okay.
Between 2008 and 2015, 75% of the organizations that lost their charitable status after RAD audits were Muslim charities.
75%. That's a significant number.
It is.
Is there anything else that might point to this potential targeting of Muslim groups?
Yes, and this one might surprise you. Even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, back in 2021, admitted there were concerns about systemic racism and Islamophobia within government institutions,
Really?
including the CRA, and he made these remarks during a national summit on Islamophobia, so it wasn't just a casual comment.
So Trudeau himself admitted that there was a problem.
Well, he didn't specifically call out the RAD
Right.
or say it was intentionally discriminatory, but his acknowledgement that there were issues within the CRA, particularly relating to systemic bias, carries a lot of weight.
So we've got a watchdog group reporting this disproportionate number of Muslim charities losing their status. And
Right.
we've got Trudeau acknowledging the possibility of systemic bias within the CRA. Anything else?
There's also a report from the University of Toronto's Institute of Islamic Studies.
Okay.
That adds another layer to this.
Okay.
Their research actually found that Muslim charities were being disproportionately targeted for audits by the CRA.
Hmm.
They identify what they called structural biases
I see.
within the CRA's audit process,
Okay.
and that these biases could be contributing to this disparity.
What kind of structural biases are we talking about? Can you give me an example?
Sure, one of the biases they identified is the perception of Muslims as inherently foreign or outsiders.
Okay.
And this kind of thinking, of course, can lead to unfair scrutiny of their financial activities, even if those activities are perfectly legitimate.
Right.
So this report essentially provides further evidence that the audits operations may have been influenced by prejudice against Muslims, which resulted in these potentially discriminatory auditing practices.
So we have reports from independent groups, a statement from the Prime Minister, and academic research, all pointing to potential bias within the CRA,
Exactly.
particularly affecting Muslim charities.
Yes,
It's a pretty concerning picture.
it is.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second. What about the RAD's original purpose? Investigating terrorism financing is serious business.
Absolutely.
Was there actually any evidence that they were effective in uncovering any real threats?
That's a great question, and that's where things get a little bit murky.
Right.
While the RAD's mandate was crucial, critics argue that the lack of transparency and the potential for bias overshadow any successes they might have had.
Right.
We simply don't have enough information,
Right.
publicly available information,
Yeah.
about specific cases or convictions that came from the RAD's investigations.
Mm.
So this lack of transparency makes it incredibly difficult to judge their effectiveness, and it really just fuels more suspicion about their motives and their methods.
So we're basically left with a black box.
Right.
We know the RAD existed, we know their mandate, we know there's some serious concerns about their methods and potential bias,
Right.
but it's tough to gauge what they actually accomplished.
Right, and that's a big part of the problem. When you have a lack of transparency and you combine that with allegations of bias, it really erodes public trust,
Yeah.
especially within the communities that feel targeted.
Right, and this brings us back to Freeland's pledge.
Exactly.
By promising to dismantle the RAD, she's basically acknowledging that the division had become more problematic than effective.
That's right.
And by promising an independent oversight body, she's aiming to address this lack of accountability and transparency that's been plaguing the CRA.
Absolutely. Her pledge is a direct response to all the criticisms and evidence we've been discussing.
Yeah.
And it signals a potential shift in how the government, specifically the Liberal Party, wants to approach these really important issues.
Right.
National security, religious freedom, and that very difficult balance
Yeah.
between protecting citizens and respecting their rights.
It's a high-stake move for sure, especially given the issues between the Liberal Party and Muslim communities.
Absolutely.
This pledge could be a crucial step towards rebuilding trust,
Right.
but it remains to be seen how it will actually play out and what the long-term impact will be.
Yeah, that's a great point. We need to consider the reactions to Freeland's pledge and what this could all mean for charitable organizations in Canada, especially the ones serving Muslim communities.
Right.
It also raises questions about systemic bias within government institutions and what needs to be done to ensure fairness and equity for all Canadians.
And those are questions that we're going to delve into right after the break.
We've been talking about the RAD and these controversial practices they have, but it's important to understand the historical context here. How did this all begin?
Yeah, I think looking back can help us understand why the RAD was even created in the first place and maybe how its role has changed over time.
Exactly. So let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
Go back to the aftermath of 9/11. It was a time of fear and uncertainty, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Both in Canada and globally,
Right.
governments everywhere were trying to figure out how to strengthen national security and prevent future attacks.
Yeah, the world definitely changed after 9/11. There was this immense prayer to find and stop any possible sources of terrorism, including, the financing of these activities.
Exactly, and that's what led to the RAD being created within the CRA.
Mm.
Their job was to investigate financial transactions, anything that could be linked to terrorism.
Okay.
It was seen as a proactive way to fight terrorism, stop these potential threats before they could even happen.
Right, so the RAD was created because of a real concern for national security. It was a response to the threat of terrorism. But as we've discussed, how they actually operated has come under a lot of scrutiny,
Right.
with accusations of bias and overreach.
Yes.
It seems like the initial intentions, which were understandable, might have paved the way for the very problems we're seeing now.
That's a really important point. While the RAD's initial focus was rooted in national security, critics argue that over time, Their methods and who they targeted, it kind of went off track.
Yeah.
This led to Muslim charities being targeted without having enough evidence
Right.
or justification.
It's like what happens with some policies. They start with good intentions, but without the right oversight and adjustments, they can end up being harmful.
Right.
Do you think that's what happened with the RAD?
It's definitely a possibility. The climate after 9/11 created this urgency to act. So maybe in that rush to do something, those safeguards and oversight weren't as strong as they should have been.
Yeah.
And over time, that could have allowed for those biases to creep in.
Right.
And then lead to the discriminatory practices that are now the center of all this controversy.
It's a cautionary tale, I guess.
It is.
About the importance of staying vigilant and always reassessing these policies, making sure they're still doing what they were intended to do and not causing unintended harm.
Absolutely. And it really underlines the need for that independent oversight,
Right.
which is what Freeland is addressing directly with her pledge.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, but let's look at it from a different angle.
Okay.
Are there any voices out there supporting the RAD or arguing against dismantling it? I mean, it's important to consider all sides of the story.
You're absolutely right. And while there hasn't been a lot of people publicly defending the RAD and their specific practices, there are some who believe that getting rid of it completely could make Canada more vulnerable to terrorism financing.
Okay.
They argue that even with its flaws, the RAD still played a vital role in keeping the country safe.
So it's a balancing act, isn't it?
Yes.
Between security and concerns about civil liberties and discrimination. How do we reconcile these priorities?
It's definitely complex. There's no easy answer.
Right.
Some might say that in the fight against terrorism, some level of profiling or targeted scrutiny is necessary.
Right.
They might even say that you need to sacrifice some individual liberties to ensure the safety and security of everyone.
And there's the argument that dismantling a whole division within the CRA might send the wrong message.
Yes.
Potentially embolden those who might try to take advantage of Canada's financial systems for illegal purposes.
Exactly. Those are valid points. But then on the other hand, you have the evidence of bias.
Right.
The loss of trust within certain communities.
Yeah.
And the question of whether it's ever okay to target people or organizations based on their religion rather than concrete evidence.
Right. It seems like the challenge is finding a way to address the concerns about bias and discrimination without making us less safe.
Yes.
Is there a middle ground?
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe it's not about completely getting rid of the RAD, but restructuring it or implementing much stricter oversight.
Right.
Or maybe coming up with entirely new approaches to investigating terrorism financing that are both effective and respectful of people's rights.
So it's about finding that balance where national security and individual rights are both protected.
Yes.
It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about making them both work.
You got it. And that's why Freeland's promise to create that independent CRA oversight body is so important.
Right.
Having someone neutral monitoring what the CRA is doing could help ensure that those investigations are conducted fairly and transparently,
Yeah.
which could then help to rebuild some of that trust.
Yeah, which has been damaged because of the allegations against the RAD.
Exactly.
So it's not just about getting rid of one division.
No.
It's about reforming the whole system.
Right.
It's about recognizing the problems and putting safeguards in place so that those problems don't happen again.
Exactly. And this is where I think the conversation needs to go beyond just the RAD and the CRA.
Okay.
This really points to a bigger issue of systemic bias in government and the need for a system-wide change.
You're right. You're bringing up a much larger point. It's about understanding that these systems are made up of people.
Yes.
And people have biases.
Yes.
Conscious or unconscious.
Absolutely.
And those biases can influence policies and practices, leading to unfairness and injustice.
Exactly. And addressing systemic bias isn't a one-time fix. It needs a multifaceted approach.
Right.
Education, awareness, training,
Yeah.
and putting safeguards in place to lessen the impact of human biases.
It's about building a culture of inclusion and equity within these organizations so that everyone feels valued and respected and safe from discrimination. It's a huge task, but an important one if we want to create a just and equitable society.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's shift back to Freeland and her political goals. How might this pledge affect her chances of winning the Liberal leadership and even the next election?
It's definitely a strategic move, especially with the relationship between the Liberal Party and Muslim communities being so strained.
It is.
By addressing this issue head-on, she's showing that she's listening and ready to take action.
Right.
But is it genuine or just political maneuvering?
That's the question a lot of people are asking.
Yeah.
On one hand, it makes sense to appeal to a group of voters who feel let down by the current government.
Right.
If she can convince Muslim voters that she's sincere and will keep her promises, it could get a lot of support for her candidacy.
But there's risk too, isn't there?
Oh, for sure.
Some might see it as just a way to get votes without actually meaning to deliver on those promises.
Exactly.
What happens if she wins but doesn't follow through?
It could backfire big time. If she's seen as not being sincere, or if she wins and doesn't keep her promises, it could actually alienate the very people she's trying to reach and hurt the Liberal Party even more.
Yeah.
It's a big gamble.
So it's a strategic move, but beyond the politics, what does this pledge tell us about how things are changing politically in Canada? Do you think this shows that parties are starting to approach diversity and inclusion differently?
I think it reflects this growing awareness that diversity and inclusion are so important in Canada,
Yeah.
and that political leaders need to address these issues more directly and authentically.
Right.
It's not enough to ignore or downplay the concerns of marginalized communities anymore.
It seems like things are changing, and voters are demanding that their leaders take action and be accountable.
They are.
And it's not just about getting elected.
Hmm.
It's about governing effectively in a society that's diverse and complex.
Exactly.
The leaders who will succeed are the ones who can bridge those divides,
Right.
build consensus, and create policies that work for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond just token gestures
Right.
and toward meaningful representation and inclusion.
Yeah.
And Freeland's pledge, whatever her reasons are, could be what pushes this change forward.
Right.
It puts the issue right in the spotlight and makes other leaders address it too.
So it's bigger than just Freeland and her political ambitions.
Yes.
It's about a shift in the whole political conversation.
Right.
It's about owning up to past mistakes, fixing systemic problems, and creating a society that's more fair and inclusive.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that needs to keep going.
Yes, it does. And it's a conversation we're going to continue right after the break. We've spent a lot of time talking about Freeland's pledge and this whole controversy with the RAD. But I think it's important to step back and think about the bigger picture here. What are the implications of all this? Not just for Freeland, but for Canada as a whole.
You know, I think this whole story really highlights how crucial oversight and accountability are,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to these powerful institutions like the CRA.
Right.
It's pretty worrying that the RAD operated for years without much external scrutiny.
It makes you wonder about transparency, right? Do we have the right mechanisms in place to make sure that these agencies aren't going too far or abusing their power?
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing those potential abuses, it's also about maintaining public trust. When people feel confident that things are being done fairly and openly, they're more likely to trust the system. But once that trust is broken, it can be really hard to get it back.
Trust is so important,
It is.
especially in a democracy.
Absolutely. And that's why what Freeland is doing, pledging to create that independent oversight body for the CRA, is so significant.
Right.
It shows that she understands that rebuilding trust isn't just about talk, it takes action.
It's about having those systems in place so that people feel like their concerns will be heard and that they have ways to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly. And, you know, that brings us to another important point. The power of people speaking up and taking action. Think about the groups like the NCCM and all the individuals who've been vocal about the RAD's practices.
They've really been key in bringing this issue to light and starting a national conversation about it. They've shown that even when you're going up against these powerful institutions, change is possible when people come together and demand accountability.
It's a reminder that speaking up is important, even when you feel like you're up against a system that wants to silence you. Real change takes time. It takes effort and the courage to challenge things.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a society that's more just and equitable.
Well said. Now let's go back to that tension between national security and individual rights.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's about finding that balance between protecting ourselves from threats, but also protecting the very freedoms that define us.
Right, and there's no easy solution. Are always going to be people who believe that security should come before everything else, while others will prioritize individual liberties above all else.
I think both sides have valid points, and we need to approach this issue with a lot of thought and care. We need to be smart about security, but we can't let it come at the expense of our values.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where security and freedom can work together. True security isn't just about more surveillance and tougher measures. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and respected.
And that's something worth working towards. It takes constant dialogue, critical thinking, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the heart of what we've been discussing, the importance of being engaged citizens in a democracy. It's understanding that we all have a role in creating the kind of society we want to live in.
A society that values diversity, listens to everyone, and where justice and equity aren't just words, but something we see in our everyday lives.
We've talked about Freeland's pledge, the problems with the RAD, and the bigger questions about bias and the balance between security and freedom. But this is just the start of the conversation.
It really is, and we encourage all of our listeners to keep thinking about these issues, keep talking about them, and to be part of shaping the future of our democracy.
Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
And that's it for this deep dive into Chrystia Freeland's pledge and the controversy surrounding the CRA's Research and Analysis Division. Thanks for joining us.